Good evening, YouTube. The doctor is in. Hello, everybody. This is Doc Swift again. Today I'll be talking about The Last Warpiper. In my first video, I read Chapter 1 of this new novel, which is available on Amazon. The link will be in the description, so give it a check if you want to see if you want to read a little bit more about it from the description on Amazon. I hope you give it a read. If you do, please post a review and maybe post a comment here if you check it out. Today what I'm going to be talking about is some of the world building that went into the prep for writing this novel. Now there are books and there are other YouTube videos that will give advice about generalities related to world building. Instead of talking in general terms, what I'll be talking about is what went into the specific world building for this novel. First of all, everything that I'll be talking about, like the novel itself, it takes place on the continent of Vistir. Now, this is the only part of the world that has any information provided to the reader. The reason is because everything else would be kind of extraneous. It would be irrelevant. Rather than have an info dump listing the name of the world and all the other continents, naming the oceans and everything. Since none of that is really important to this particular story, I have it all figured out, but you won't find it in the book. That's for later stories to reveal as needed to tell a story. So rather than try to make a single video that might take a half an hour, I'm just going to talk about different aspects of world building in the next couple videos. This one I'll be talking about the races of this fantasy world. Instead of creating a Tolkien-esque fantasy world with orcs and elves and dwarves and goblins and some of the more traditional fantasy races people might be familiar with, early on I decided I want this world to have none of the typical fantasy races except for humans. That way there's someone in the characters, in the POV characters, that the reader can relate to directly. Instead of the typical races and their ancestral rivalries or hatreds that are fairly typical in fantasy, with elves, for instance, wanting to protect nature, dwarves wanting to be miners and forgers, humans living in big cities on the surface. What we'll have here are a set of races that I believe are unique in fantasy books. I based all the non-human races on anthropomorphic animals. So there are cat people, there are wolf people, there are bison people, fish people. One of the consequences of making the races anthropomorphic animals is that there will be inherent rivalries and conflicts between them. For instance, cat people, like cats, will be very territorial. They will want to defend their territory so that other predatory species and other races based on predatory animals can't take their prey and thus force the cat people to be hungry. So what you'll see is the wolf people will form packs, the cat people will form prides, the bison people will form herds, and in that way some of the expectations of the reader will be present in the portrayal of these races. From the first chapter, what you see is a battle between the humans and the cat people, and it's mentioned that they were formerly allies against the bear people. So this is a little allusion to a short story in Cats of War, my first book, which came out earlier in 2019. And that story, Duel for the North, deals with the invasion of the bear folk, the Arctanth people, into the lands of the cat folk and the humans. And so they are allied against the bear folk in that story. Whereas in The Last Warpiper, the humans and catfolk are now at odds with one another. And as the story unfolds, you learn why. So rather than try to give that away now, that's one of the things I'll be leaving for the reader to discover, because it's covered pretty well. It's part of the underlying plot that led to that battle to open the book. So that is one of the ways that you want to construct your fantasy races. You want to, however you base them, you want to make sure that there are relationships between the races in some fashion, whether cooperative, allied, rivals, outright enemies, hostility, neutral, whatever. That's part of what you need to put into the prep for writing any long-form fiction. You need to do it for shorter fiction too, but you don't need to be as detailed with it, simply because you're writing a shorter piece, and it's obviously, you don't want to overwhelm the reader with information dumps in a short story. So, as a consequence of having no fantasy races, I was left with the decision of whether or not to put typical fantasy monsters. And because of the magic weapons that the Warpipers wield, I realized I needed at least some of the typical fantasy monsters. Dragons, trolls, for instance. The protagonist of The Last Warpiper, Hark, carries a set of bagpipes made from the throat sac of a dragon, which, when he activates the magic, allows him to project fire from the drones. So if you look in the image, you see the smoke curling up from the drones of the bagpipes. That's one of the monster races that exists. However, I wanted to avoid some of the traditional fantasy tropes. I didn't want dragons flying over and terrorizing villages, anything like that. So part of the world building is involved with explaining, or at least assigning, where these the peoples, whether they're humans or the anthropomorphic animals, might come into contact with the monsters. And the way to do that was fairly simple. You just make allusion to a cataclysmic event in the past when the monsters were driven back or driven to extinction, so that you don't have to have stories where trolls come through and wipe out a town, or dragons, burn a village to the ground. That frees you up from some of the baggage, but it also requires you to be creative if you want to have your characters encounter, for example, a dragon. And that can give you access to a little bit of the hero's journey in literal terms, where your characters actually have to undergo a significant journey of some distance to meet a dragon or to find a troll, for instance. In The Last Warpiper, there are several of these anthropomorphic animal species that are met. There are others that are mentioned, and it all serves the story. If you want to have different races, but they aren't present, go ahead and do the world building. It's the same with creating the names of all the continents that you never mentioned, so that when you write later stories, you already have everything detailed for this setting, and it's just ready. It's like a toolbox. You just take the tools out and you get the job done. For The Last Warpiper, rather than have mixed races, For instance, Dungeons and Dragons, you have half elves, half orcs. Because of the fundamental difference between humans and cat people and wolf people, there will be no half races. So the different cultures, certainly among the territorial species, are isolated from one another. They don't interact, certainly not to the point of breeding with one another, because the interbreeding is impossible. You've got cooperation at times. So, as I mentioned, humans and the cat folk were allies in the past. They're enemies now. But you can still have cooperation because the humans and the cat people aren't necessarily competing with one another. So that's part of how you flesh out your fantasy races. If your wolf people form packs, how do the packs interact with one another? If the bison people form herds, how do the herds interact with one another? How do the herds interact with the packs? Obviously, you can guess that they will interact with hostility because one's a predatory species and one isn't. Because of the nature of predatory species and prey species, I went ahead and assigned a general rule that the prey species, for instance, the buffalo folk, the bison folk, will be allies and perhaps even live near or among humans because they're a herding species. They want to gather together for protection. Again, this is not something that's specifically spelled out, but it's mentioned that the bison folk are not strangers to humans, and they even live within the realm that humans control. So, again, the idea is to avoid some of the familiar tropes as regards fantasy races, and that gives you freedom to tell different kinds of stories. You can still rely on some tropes, there are only so many kinds of stories after all. You have to find little avenues to inject originality, but you don't want it to be so different that the readers are turned off because it's unrecognizable and maybe distasteful as a result. So that's how I tried to balance casting aside the traditional while holding on to some elements of classical storytelling, especially for fantasy stories. So I think that's about all I want to say about how I constructed the races in The Last Warpiper, the fantasy races. I want to talk, perhaps in the next video, I'll talk about how I went about creating the magic system for The Last Warpiper. And because I have dragons in here, I think I'll have a video where I talk about how I went about designing the dragons so that they are unique and distinct from dragons in mythology or fantasy literature, but are still recognizable as dragons to the reader. So let's look for those in the future. I want to remind everybody that The Last Warpiper is available on Amazon. Check out my other video if you want to hear me reading Chapter 1. Give you a feel for how I introduce the characters, how I introduce the magic use of the war pipes. And if you do check it out, please post a review. I'd love to hear what readers think. Please let me know what you think of this video. It's only my second one. I'm obviously got a lot to learn. And, well, if it sucks, let me know. I wouldn't be surprised, but I guess I will sign off now, and I hope to hear what you think. Have a good one.